I'm going to pass it on next to Mr. Matt Wilson. He's a physical scientist at the Office of Coast Survey, Hydrographic Surveys Division here in my office. And he's going to talk about what he's been working specifically for Coast Survey and our bathymetry pipeline to dive more in detail. So take it away, Matt.
Okay, thank you, Commander Hillstrom. You can see my slides. Okay, yeah, and thanks to you, Bree and Deanne and Tony, also Admiral Evans earlier for the really great introductions to this topic. I'll be able to get into a lot more detail in this presentation. And so yeah, this is regarding our implementation of data licensing in Coast Survey. So why do we need data licensing and how will we implement it? Slide, please. So Tony, in his presentation, set the stage for the larger data governance landscape within NOAA and where data licensing fits into it. So I'll talk now about how this applies to the Office of Coast Survey and to specifically our bathymetry. So let's start with that question. Why do we, the Office of Coast Survey, need data licensing? And I'll talk about this in two different capacities. The first one is concerning open bathymetry. And this is bathymetry that we wish to be as open, accessible, and usable as possible. This is data that needs to conform to the Evidence Act and the open data requirements that Tony just spoke of. It's our bathymetry, that is the bathymetry that NOAA collects or that we've acquired through our hydrographic services contract. That all falls into this category. A lot of external data that we ingest falls in this category too. And so what we've always done with this kind of data is to state that the data is in the public domain and we make it publicly available. And there's a perception that that's good enough and that's all we need to do. But I've learned that's just not true. There's a lot of users and a significant part of the industry who can't use that data. So who are these users? Well, they are private industry folks. The vagueness of the public domain label just isn't good enough. They have fear of lingering copyright. It's too risky for them. International users as well. Different countries have different definitions of what public domain actually means. So they may not be able to use that data either. The application of an open data license onto bathymetry removes all this ambiguity. So when I say open license in this context, I'm referring specifically to the public domain dedication licenses, and the ones most commonly known are CC0 from Creative Commons or PDDL from Open Data Commons. Of note, CC0 has been recommended explicitly by the US government for US government work, and these licenses, they legally remove copyright and gives all users the assurance they need to freely use the data. So this makes us much more aligned with the Evidence Act and the open data requirements, and therefore we're achieving the objectives within the NOAA data strategy. Okay, slide please. So let's talk about the other major thrust of why we need data licensing, and this is related to external data. So that is data that we didn't collect, but rather we acquired it opportunistically or it was submitted to us voluntarily. External data is increasingly important to us. It's a critical part of our ocean mapping objectives, and the importance of external data is underscored further as it's in the Coast Survey Strategic Plan, it's in the NOMEC strategy, it's in Seabed 2030. All these initiatives underscore collaboration, and data sharing is the only way to achieve our mapping objectives. So when we receive external data, what happens is that we ingest it and then we execute a research phase that involves, in addition to the standard review and verification of data quality, we need to find out who that data actually belongs to and what we can actually use it for. So this takes time. It requires meetings, a lot of back and forth, and the answers that we get aren't always totally clear. So only then, if we're able to, or if we feel confident enough, can we use the data for our various products and services, for example, ENCs, marine modeling, or precision navigation. So who are the external data providers? There's a very long list. They are federal partners, academia, foreign country hydrographic offices, cities, states, parks, ports, from the private industry, survey companies, engineering firms, et cetera. And note that very few of these are covered under any kind of data sharing agreement. It's mostly one-offs, and most of them just want to submit their data and then move on to do other things. So the big problem is that there's no way currently to standardize how we handle this data, particularly if there's any restrictions. So slide, please. That leads to the next part. What if there are restrictions on these external data sets? And so this is where the process can really bog down. There's a reality too that there's a tsunami of data coming at us. As you see the image there on the left, it's applicable. The numbers are really accelerating. We anticipate submissions to increase in the coming years as we have more and more collaboration, which is excellent. You know, that collaboration is exactly what we want, but it just means more data. And plus, with the proliferation of autonomous technology, the data streams are picking up, and they're picking up fast. So, and we don't have a standardized way of handling data that might be subject to some kind of restriction. And this has been identified as one of the biggest impediments to streamline throughput. When we receive external data, we need to know clearly and unambiguously who owns the data. It sounds like a simple question, but it's not always simple, trust me. There's been times in the past when we discovered weeks or even months after the fact that a particular data set we received actually belongs to someone else other than who provided it to us. So that represents real risk. We also need to know, can we share that data? Can we make it publicly available? Can we make products from the data? Can third parties use the data? Can they use it for commercial purposes? So the application of a data license answers all of these questions very clearly. We may not even need to have a meeting. We might just already have our answers right there. They're explicitly defined in the license. Slide, please. So here's how data licensing works and how it solves the problem. A provider assigns a data license onto their data. And note, this license is specific to a data set, not to a provider. So this allows for flexibility in that it's not constrained to an overarching agreement. It can be very specific to suit a particular scenario. So now all the terms, meaning how we can use the data, how we can share it, they're all clearly defined. And furthermore, they're all machine readable. So when we ingest it, the distribution and the ensuing applications are all automated. For data licensed for public distribution, third-party users get that data and the license, and they know exactly what they can and can't do with it. There's much clearer communication to these end users with the license included. And for the open bathymetry, the terms on the open license totally resolves that issue with the ambiguity of public domain and what that actually means. So users have the assurance they need to use the data for their intended purposes. And of note here is that the National Bathymetric source, that's the Office of Coast Survey's database for the best available bathymetry, accommodates data licenses. To the credit of the NBS team, they had data licensing in mind from the inception of the database, so they're ready to realize all the benefits of using data licenses in terms of automation and scalable processes related to the data handling. Slide, please. Okay, what else is pushing us to data licensing? As already described, it's a critical part of the NOAA data strategy. Also, the NOAA Science Advisory Board recommended data licensing for federal government data with language that's nearly identical to our own. And Tony had mentioned as well, the US government recommended data licensing for US government works. And also the International Hydrographic Organization has given recommendations on data licensing, stating that in open license applications, what you really need to enable users the freedom to use your data to experiment, explore, and innovate. So of course, those are things we want. Slide, please. Okay, the recommendation for data licensing is quite clear. So then the question becomes, which data licenses do we actually adopt? We've proposed the license options from Creative Commons for many reasons. They're very well known and universal licenses, internationally recognized and already used throughout a wide variety of industries, including our own. There are already prominent examples of Creative Commons licenses applied to bathymetric data sets. Also, Creative Commons licenses were recommended explicitly in several of those references I had on the previous slide. For external data submissions, we always encourage for that data to come in under an open license. But the reality is sometimes providers have restrictions, as I already laid out. For data with any restrictions, the options in the Creative Commons license suite encompass the various scenarios we see. Those restrictions you see there in the blue font, you can select attribution. That just means that you have to give credit to the data provider when using their data. It's a pretty common one. The non-commercial tag is self-explanatory. If that's switched on, the data is not to be used for commercial purposes. The share-like restriction means that any derivative products created from the data need to maintain that same license. And finally, that no derivatives tag means you can't make derivative products from the original data. For Coast Survey, the ENC, marine models, and precision marine navigation are all considered derivative products. Slide, please. Okay, the table on this slide really tells the whole story of our implementation. The various license conditions are in that first column. They're matched up against our various uses for data along the top row. So those uses in broad terms are as follows here. You know, can we use the data for internal use, such as survey planning? Can we share the data publicly? Can we ingest it into the National Bathymetric Source Database? And finally, can we create derivative products from the data? For example, the ENC and so forth. So starting on the bottom row, actually, we have a custom-made internal use only license that will apply to any sensitive data we might receive. And that's nothing new. We've always handled sensitive data submissions. This is data not for public archive due to historic property, or if simply the provider just doesn't allow it. That kind of data we're only using internally for survey planning or just simply informing us where we need to go survey next. Next, I'll point out how the share alike and no derivatives conditions that prohibits us from using that data for ENC or other derivative products. And data under any other license is used for all purposes. It just depends on whether or not they maintain source attribution or the non-commercial use tag. So there we go. This is what we want. This table right here, this really tells the whole story, and it represents automation. Frankly, the data all comes in, and it's going to have one or more of these license conditions. So we already know exactly how we can distribute it and exactly how we can use it. It's clearly defined. In other words, all the data is falling neatly into one of these little grid squares. And so this means automation. It means standardized data handling. And because it's automated, it can scale. We can scale up to meet the ever increasing data volume. So, and it also has the benefit of increasing access to our data to a much wider user base and improving communication to end users. Slide, please. Okay, and that was my last slide. So I just want to thank you all for your attention and thank the HSRP for all their engagement and comments. And this process has been very constructive in socializing the topic. So look forward to the remainder of the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.